Welcome to psychology. We're going to do part 2 on chapter 1. And this is going to focus mostly on research. So if you remember from part 1, we began with stating psychology is a science and uses the scientific method to conduct research based on and the exploration of the 4 goals of psychology. We also touched on the role of the skills of critical thinking to assist each of us in our day-to-day and also enabling us to determine facts from beliefs and falsehoods. Now in this part, we're going to explore how psychology and other sciences are designed in order to research empirically. We're going to look at methodology, or the steps required to properly conduct research, and the checks and balances included to avoid biases, either by the participants or the researchers. So understanding research and the practice of psychology. Now, as a reminder, the scientific method is an organized way of using experience and testing ideas in order to expand and refine knowledge using the 4 goals of psychology as a starting point or as a focus. We start by identifying research problems, and then we design a study to investigate the problems. We collect data and analyze the data. We draw conclusions. We communicate those findings to others. So we begin by formulating a research question. Now this might come from our own personal experience. It might come from literature searches. Many times it comes from people who know somebody or know of something that if they could figure out a better solution, it would help themselves and many others. So they come from their own personal experience. But at any point, you need to begin with a research question. And then you do a hypothesis. This is a specific statement about behavior or mental processes that is to be tested through your research or experiment. It's a prediction about what cause and effect relationship might occur between 2 or more variables. And then you test the hypothesis through controlled methods such as an experiment. You try not to confuse correlations. Correlations are not cause and effect. Correlations are associations. They occur at the same time, but they don't cause. And we'll revisit correlations a little bit later in this particular video. Now, researchers use a controlled or managed way of observing others to describe what is observed and pass no judgment, just record. And that takes a lot of practice. It's not something we all do normally. We describe things, but with personal biases. We don't describe things by what they are and only by what they are. Now, when we do our research, these are known as descriptive methods of research. And we're going to look at 3 methods that are used. Now, they come with their own strengths and weaknesses. Case study, surveys, and naturalistic observations. Now, case studies, information is collected about an individual or a small group. It's rarely done, in fact, it's not done in large groups, usually individuals. 3 Faces of Eve, Sybil are 2 examples of case studies that were done on people with multiple personalities as a way of describing what that might look like through these people's experience. So it's helpful. It can provide some useful information. It could be obtained through no other means but this objective way. Now, case studies can provide compelling portraits, but may have factual inaccuracies, such as people's memories aren't always as good as we think they are. Maybe people's memories have gaps, and interviewers may have expectation or biases that can influence the case study. And so it's not all bad, but it has to be guarded against being held as being an authentic and empirically based research. Now, the second one is called survey. It's used to study individuals who cannot be observed in the natural settings or studied scientifically. Interviews or questionnaires are used to gather information about attitudes, beliefs, experiences, or behaviors of a group of people. Now, you may have done a survey. Maybe you've been to a mall and they will stop you in the mall and ask you some questions about your experience. Those surveys are gathering information. The quality of the questions make a huge difference as to how good a survey is. Also, as a source of inaccuracy, subjects may recall memories with inaccuracies. They may even not tell the truth. They may respond to in a particularly good light. Subjects may also have the inaccuracy of social desirability. That is, they'll tell the interviewer what they think the interviewer wants to hear. Now that's a problem in case studies as well, of course. The third is naturalistic observation. Now, here, people will observe other people in their natural habitats. Unobtrusive measures are used to avoid interfering with the behaviors that are being observed. For example, Jane Goodall observed the behavior of chimpanzees in their natural environment. When I was a behavior consultant, I went to daycares to observe children, and there was a couple of daycares that had two-way glass. So I could sit behind glass and not be seen. It would look like a mirror on the other side, but I could watch the children and make observations without them seeing me. To avoid sampling problems. Now, sampling problems we'll get into, and we're going to talk about what is a sample. If I have a bucket of water come from my tap, it's in a big bucket, and I dip a cup into it, I've got a sample of water. Now that sample is inclusive of everything that's in that bucket. I just took a sample. So what we want to do is avoid problems in gathering our group to sample for an experiment. So research sampling is very important to any research question. A research sample is part of a population that is being studied in order to reach conclusions about the entire population. That by dipping my cup into the bucket of water, I can sample the water and know that the rest of the bucket of water will taste just like this. It's a representative sample. So as we know, we couldn't study a whole population. If I wanted to study nurses and find out what burns them out, if I was to try to do research on all nurses in Canada, that would be too hard, too big a population. So we need to select a representative sample that mirrors the population of interest. This includes subgroups in the same proportion that we find them in the population. So if I was studying nurses and I see there's a distribution of 80-20 of female to male, then my sample needs to keep that same distribution of 80% female and 20% male. This acts as a way to be sure that the selection bias is not interfering with our findings. A selection bias meaning selecting participants and assigning participants to experiments and control groups at the beginning of the experiment that will predictably affect the outcome of the experiment. Can't do that. One way to attain a representative sample is by the use of a random sampling. In this instance, participants in the experimental and control groups are selected by chance procedure. Everybody has equal chance to be in either group, control or experimental. And so this controls for the selection bias. So let's move on to the experimental method. The preferred method for answering questions about cause and effect is the experimental method. It allows psychologists to control experiences of subjects and to draw conclusions about cause and effect. Now, here are some terms. I've already used some of these terms, but I'm going to introduce them as definition terms right now. Now, we mentioned about variables, just touched on it. There's two types of variables. There's an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable is a factor or condition deliberately manipulated to determine whether it causes change in another behavior or condition. So researchers are going to deliberately maneuver or manipulate the independent variable. So for example, if I'm experimenting with nurses about about stress and we want to try meditation, meditation is the independent variable because we're hoping that meditation is going to manage stress in nurses. So the dependent variable, that's any condition or factor that can be manipulated, controlled, or measured. It's measured at the end of the experiment. So if I'm measuring stress, I have to measure something that can be controlled or counted, measured. So I have to be able to measure things like heart rate, breathing, breath, respiration rate. I may be looking at some other conditions that I can measure and count to determine whether or not I'm having an impact on the behavior. So another group we need to talk about, because I've referenced them already, is experimental and control groups. The experimental group obtains the treatment or the independent variable. The control groups, they don't receive the treatment. A group similar to the experimental group, the control group is exposed to the same experimental environment, however, they're not given the independent variable. They're used as a comparison. So did the experimental group's results show a difference from the control group, and if so, what? So let's look at controlling for the research and participants' expectations. We have to manage those sorts of things. And one of the first components we need to touch on is what's known as a placebo. Fake treatment or sugar pill, typically when a participant's expectations influence the outcome rather than the independent variable. So protecting against the effects of expectations, researchers use blind and double-blind experiments. A blind experiment is to control for the expectations and effects by creating conditions where the subjects are unaware of the treatment. Whereas a double-blind, neither the subject nor the experimenter know who has obtained the treatment. Now, I did introduce referenced it earlier in the video, about correlational research. Correlational research looks at the explanation of phenomena by looking at other factors that occur along with the phenomenon. Now, it's important to note it's not cause and effect. To correlate just means two things occur at the same time. So it expresses a relationship between two variables. It doesn't show causation. Why do students drop out of college? What factors might influence that decision? Correlation describes the strength of relationship between two or more variables. In other words, it explains how likely it is that you will find two variables together. For example, students' dropout rate and feelings of isolation are highly correlated. It doesn't cause, because not all isolated students drop out. So when students feel isolated, they are at greater risk of dropping out. We use a correlational coefficient to identify how strongly this link of these two variables are. And the range goes from -1 to +1. This means that the variables can be positively or negatively correlated. 0 indicates the variables are unrelated. Now, a couple of other remaining issues to research is around ethics of research on humans and that of animals. So when we look at ethics of research of humans, there must be respect for the dignity of the person. This includes basic human rights, fair treatment, informed consent, privacy and confidentiality of participants. Responsible caring needs to occur. This includes competence and self-knowledge, maximizing benefits, minimizing risks and harm for the participants. Integrity in the relationship includes honesty, objectivity, avoidance of conflict of interest. You can see the box on deception in your textbook as an example. And there's also an element of responsibility to society. This includes respect and development of society through psychological research. Now, we do, of course, have ethics in research on animals. Psychologists use animals to conduct research that cannot be carried out with humans. The effects of early separations from mothers, for example, was an early research piece. Psychologists generalize to humans the results of research conducted with animals. Animals may not be harmed only when there's no... Animals may be harmed only when there's no other alternative, and researchers believe that the benefits of the research justify the harm. It doesn't happen frequently. This is the end of part 2. I hope you carry on well, and good luck, and we'll see you in week 3.